Good. So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. I'm going to go around the screen quickly to let all of our participants to introduce themselves. Thank you so much for joining. Emily, should we start with you?
Yes, hello, I'm Emily Silver. I work at the Oxford Wine Company, where I take care of the retail and the marketing.
Ali?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ali Mawson, and I am the wine buyer for Australia and New Zealand at Waitrose.
Oh, and me. I'm Oz Clark. When I'm in Oxford, I drink Emily's wines. When I'm in half the rest of the country, I drink Ali's. And I talk about wine, write about wine, appear on television. And I'm a tremendous fan of what Australia's created for our wine drinking culture here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, again for joining. So the reason we wanted to put this together is the history of ABS very much is rooted in Australia. In fact, only until about 2004, the company was named Australian Wineries. And before then, whilst we were importing other wines from other countries, Australia was very much at the forefront of the portfolio. And launching a brand in my father and Graham Cranswick-Smith and Julius Barrett launching a brand in 1991 called Barramundi, which was really the epitome of sunshine in the bottle. It had sunshine on the label and unashamedly Australian, which was went to quite a nice large brand in supermarkets across Europe. So we thought, well, what has changed over the last 30, 40 years in Australian wine, and what role does it play in the consumer's mind, or perhaps introducing non-wine drinking consumers to drinking wine for the first time. So back in the 80s and early 80s, Australian wine wasn't necessarily seen abundantly in the supermarkets. And Oz, I'd like to come to you first as to when was the eureka moment of Australian wine that it started appearing in supermarkets, and what was the view of the historical wine trade as to this new kid on the block?
The historical wine trade's view was we don't want anything to do with it at all. They're a bunch of ruffians from the far south, and they beat us at cricket, and they don't wear their tie the right way around when they try and take us out to lunch. And they wanted nothing to do with these new wines. Also, the point is that the wine trade in Britain was very old-fashioned in those days, and the supermarkets actually in the 80s were an absolute lifeline, and that they began this enormously important role which they've had in British wine ever since. But I think people who weren't around then don't realize quite how bad cheap wine was, and why didn't Northern Europe have a popular drinking culture? Because cheap wine was disgusting. That's why. In Denmark and in Sweden and in England and in Scotland and in Ireland and in Norway, places that didn't grow anything, cheap wine was disgusting. Frankly, cheap wine was pretty disgusting in France and Spain and Italy as well, but at least it was your stuff. But our wine revolution began, strangely enough, with Germany. Germany was the first country which ever actually made wine that was impossible to like. Over the days of Rockamar and Don Cortez and Hirondelle and oh God, what's that one? Pia and Piat d'Or and all these brands, which really they were pretty frightful. Germany came along and actually said, we know how to make wine which is milder, which is fruity, which is off dry. And at one time in the 80s, I think about half the wine that we drank in this country was German. But it did actually mean that Liebfraumers was a good name, because people picked it up. Lieb, a bottle of Lieb. And it then became a bottle of, I don't know, Tesco's Hock. Hock, easy. Mosel, easy. Lieb, easy. Near China, for some reason, it caught on. But the wines weren't very good. But they did at least mean that they were popularizing the idea of drinking wine. But it was very easy to say, actually, it's pretty rubbish. And there was an awful lot of sulfur hanging around to cope with the sugar in those wines. Australia I went to Australia first as an actor, and I went to Australia second as an actor. First time I was out there was with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and I made a great friend of Patrick Stewart, who was also in the show, and he was always, I was the young squit, and he just spent his time saying, "Oh, for God's sake, Oz, I can't cope that woman any longer. Go and get some wine." And I used to go out in the streets of Melbourne and Sydney, and for $1 a bottle, come back laden with wines called Shiraz and Riesling and Hermitage and Chablis and Burgundy and all $1 a bottle. None of them have been anywhere near Burgundy or Chablis. Opened them all up, and Patrick Stewart and Timothy West and I used to drink this stuff and think, I cannot believe this wine is so wonderful. It's the cheapest wine in the shop. I remember going to the airport once, and this has become a sort of an old saw about Australia, that the taxi driver actually wants to ask you which your favorite Riesling is, because he's got views on Clare Valley versus Eden Valley versus Margaret River. And it's true. There was something about the 80s and 90s of Australia, which was a tremendous, well, it was their bicentennial for a start. That helped. They were known as these sort of gutty battlers when it came to things like the America's Cup sailing. They had, it sounds silly now, but Crocodile Dundee and Neighbours and Home and Away. These made Australia seem a massively attractive place. And to us in Northern Europe, to this wonderful open air, easygoing world. Well, when they actually started bringing wine into this country, they tried to bring it in by saying, okay, well, we can do Liebfraumilch as well. Jacobs Creek were the first people really to have a go in about 83, 84. And they brought over sort of semi-sweet 10.5% alcohol wine, and we were all just saying, but we've just tasted all this wonderful stuff that you Aussies are drinking. Give us the Aussie grog. And they then started, and Jacobs Creek was tremendously important because, of course, it never spent a bean on promotion and advertising. It became Australia's top drop. That's just a wonderful idea. Australia's top drop. Shove it on the side of half a dozen buses, and the rest of it will be done for itself. You had a wonderful woman called Hazel Murphy, God bless her, who actually, she came from Mars bars or something, and she just said, no one in this country, this is in the 80s, no one in this country talks to the members of the public. And she would go around every year, show after show after show, not wine shows, agricultural shows, stamp shows, motor shows, farming shows, all these kind of shows. And she'd put a stand up in the middle of the place and give wine away. Australian wine. Here, try this. You like a sweet wine? You like a dry wine? Have this. She gave them the same wine every time. Didn't matter, because it always tasted good. And the one thing that Australia brought to our market was the idea that cheap wine could taste good, and no one had ever done that before.
It's with lots to unpack here, because there was one thing you glossed over a little bit, which was the fact that when you said you picked up wines in Sydney and Melbourne, you were picking up Shiraz and Riesling and Chablis and Hermitage, but these were Chablis and Hermitage, not of now the very protective regions of Chablis and Hermitage. They were making Hunter River Burgundy and Chablis and Rutherglen Port, Rutherglen Tokai, of course.
All that stuff.
All now forbidden, of course, and very European protected. But perhaps the movement, and it could have been was it a blessing that Hunter River Burgundy was no longer allowed to be called Hunter River Burgundy, and they could create their own image with the grape varieties? And is it fair to say that it's the first time that grape varieties were seen on the labels of wines in the supermarkets?
Absolutely right, because that was a tremendously important thing, because we were faced, we're not very good at foreign languages, and you're faced with these long German wine labels, Italian wine labels, French wine labels, and most British people will turn off and not try to remember them and not try to understand what they mean. But Australia came over and just said, my name is Smith. I make wine from a grape called Chardonnay. You haven't heard of that? I'll say it again. Chardonnay. Call it Chardy, okay? Chardy, Smith, Chardy, Australia. Open it, drink it. It's nice, isn't it?
Right. That's it. And so simplifying everything, and with Hazel, of course, running the Australian Wine Bureau, as it was called at the time, which is, of course, an offshoot of the Australian government, taking a a plane full of journalists, important buyers, influential people in the wine trade, of course, such as yourself, Oz, on a trip of a lifetime to remove the maybe intrepid nature of shopping for Australian wine that is, of course, new, and we like our claret, and actually this is something that is new and exciting, and I think by the sounds of things, that trip created more ambassadors for Australian wine than a lot of people perhaps can ever imagine.
Yeah, I think it's true. And she understood exactly that here we were in the middle of the English winter, and she had the chance to take a bunch of these people, get the Australian government to pay for most of their expenses, but not all. She always said it's very important. Don't pay for all of their expenses. Make them pay for some, but make sure that they don't have to pay for too much, because she wants the commitment of, I've actually put 500 quid or something.
The key of running a wine trip.
But you got 2,000 quid free.
Yeah.
And she took these people, all of whom were either important wine merchants, like people like Simon Loftus at Adnams. I'm not sure that one or two of the supermarket buyers like Julian Brins didn't turn up. Ali, I would be entirely unsurprised if Julian did, because he was one of the great advocates early on of New World wines. But one thing, by the way, I have a bottle here which I think you should see.
Kanga Rouge, very good.
Kanga Rouge, Chateau Chanda, all this stuff. But look at the words on that. Kanga Rouge, oh, let's have a good old laugh. That's a funny old bottle from, it must be disgusting. It's from
the
Australia,
first of the critter labels.
1978. Look at the words underneath. Coonawarra and Shiraz. Two great words. And 1978, proper vintage. But this was a cheap wine. This wasn't your Liebfraumilch. This wasn't your Piat d'Or, but it was the Australian equivalent, and it came from a proper place, and it had proper grapes in it. So that right early on was also terribly important. By the Bin 65 from Lindemans and Penfold's Bin whatever it was, Bin 101, that wonderful Barossa Shiraz they used to make anyway. Those were two of the most important wines in the whole of England. People, a generation learned how to drink on Penfold Shiraz.
Or perhaps being introduced to wine for the first time. Yeah. And Ali, the other thing that Oz touched on briefly was the knowledge of wine in the general public of Australia. So seeing that his taxi driver was telling him about which his favourite Riesling is. I don't think you'd find a black cabbie in England telling you which their favourite Riesling was. I'm not generalising, but perhaps I am a little. And so, Ali, you've also been a buyer for a big... so they do the sales in supermarkets slightly different in Australia, but do you find that the way in which wine is sold within Australia is very different to the way in which it's sold in the UK?
So yeah, I worked for a subsidiary of the Woolworths Group, Cellar Masters, Langtons, and at the time Wine Market, in Australia between 2011 2015, and also Laithwaite's in Australia and in the UK. So yeah, I lived out in Sydney for 4 years, and as you say, the licensing is all very different. So you can't just walk down a supermarket aisle in Australia and see wine. It's in a separate part of the store, which in a way is quite conducive to making customers really focus on going into a space, and that space being all about wine, which is rather lovely. I mean, in Australia, certainly you find all of the big brands that you find over here. You absolutely do. They might have particular export labels that you see over here that you'll see less there, but all of the big brands that we know and love are very much found in Australia too. And you know, big brands are absolutely vital and have been for the whole history of Australian wine, aren't they? They're just so important for the industry. They drive amazing loyalty. They're excellent at reassuring customers on quality. You know what you're going to get with every bottle you drink, and it's also a really important signpost for value. So I think that you know, the big brands have played a really important role. You know, social commentators at the moment are saying that big brands have hugely benefited from the pandemic that we're going through, because customers are looking to be reassured and buy what they know in these strange times. And if that's to be believed, then it certainly explains the amazing growth that supermarkets have seen over this last year. But it is self-fulfilling, isn't it? If that's the wines that customers always see day to day on the shelf, then those are the wines that customers will buy every day from the shelf. So it does sort of perpetuate. I think that what the main differences are between customers buying Australian wine in Australia and customers buying Australian wine in the UK is the diversity that those Australian retailers give their customers, give their local populations. So I was looking online the other day. Dan Murphy's have got 5,500 Australian wines on their website. And if you ever get a chance to go to the Double Bay Dan Murphy's store in Sydney, it is just a treasure trove. It is just the most incredible shop. And Vintage Cellars, they're obviously a smaller outfit, but they've still got 1,600 wines on their list. And this is compared to us at Waitrose, and we've got far and away the biggest range, and we've got 92. So you can just see what amazing variety of wines that they're giving their customer base, and what huge ambassadors they are for sort of drinking local, I suppose. The other main thing, of course, that you can do in Australia is the most beautiful, wonderful, incredible cellar door visits. Wine tourism, as any Aussie knows, is such a big business. Customers go away for wonderful weekends to these stunning wine regions, stock up at the cellar door, have a fun chat to the winemaker. And whilst we try and replicate that with our sort of Waitrose Drinks Festival, which is a customer-facing event, and all the things that we do in our Waitrose media, like our weekend newspapers and food magazines and online and all these things, it doesn't replicate actually physically going to the winery. And that's something obviously that's building up in the British wine industry, and that's fantastic. And I think there'll just be more and more of it, because when a customer can experience going to that wine and talking to the winemaker, then, you know, it just builds up a sort of degree of loyalty that you can't really get just from a supermarket shelf. So
yeah, that's one thing that how consumers view on Australian wine. It's lots of, if you hear of speaking to friends not in the wine industry, they've been to the south of France and they visited a winery, and now they buy a case direct from the winery every year, and the loyalty is there forever. Of course, Australia is halfway around the world. It's a lot further to get to, but how do you think that affects the view of Australian wine en masse in supermarkets? Is what role are the wines playing, and do we do a good enough job as the wine industry to transport drinkers to Australia?
Well, so yeah, is that for me? So Australia is really important to Waitrose. Obviously, Oz touched on the fact that Waitrose has got a history with Australian wine. We sold 4.5 million bottles last year. It's our 7th biggest category. It's really important. But, you know, we've got a wine share at Waitrose of about 9% of the grocery market, and Australia is 3% for us. So we hugely undertrade in Australia. And you know, our mission statement at Waitrose is to have all of the convenience and efficiencies of a supermarket setting. But for wines, we want to give the breadth of range to our customers of an independent. So actually, I'll be fascinated to hear from Emily later about any challenges she might face as an independent, because actually it's mirrored really for us at Waitrose. We give far less shelf and secondary space to Australia than we do in our competitors. We've pushed other New World areas ahead of Australia over the last couple of years, namely South America. And unashamedly, we don't play at the very, very entry cheap end at Waitrose. We know our strengths, and we want to provide range and quality and of course value, but we don't we don't play at the very cheap end. So, you know, we have challenges. For us, it's about giving customers the breadth of range and starting to try to show them that there is more than just a Shiraz and a Chardonnay, as great as they are, and that there are different price points. And, you know, our range has at least 17 GIs covered. We cover at least 18 grape varieties. Amazing. So we're trying to broaden customers' experience, I suppose.
So, yes, amazing. I think, and of course, Waitrose are certainly doing the best job out of the big supermarkets in terms of number of GIs. I can't imagine other supermarkets having such a wide spread of GI exposure. But Emily, coming to you, and of course, with it in mind that Australia is still the #1 imported wine to the UK. It's amazing that, as you say, Ali, it's your 7th biggest category. So it's where is the wine going? We kind of sort of know, but in independence, and therefore Waitrose being treated a little bit like the independent in terms of range. In independence, Emily, why is it that, or why do you think it is that Australia doesn't have the gravitas that it does in the supermarkets, building this huge volume?
Yeah, so I mean, at OWC, Australian wine makes up a quite sort of small but important, I would say, part of our portfolio, both in terms of SKUs and in terms of revenue. We've got about 60 Australian wines on our list. So it's, you know, reasonably large number, but not as many as we have from other countries, certainly not France, Italy, European countries, and then probably not as many as South Africa as well. That would kind of go out ahead of us, mainly because we have a South African person who's quite important in our buying team. But anyway, I mean, I think I'd echo what Ali said about the Australian brands driving loyalty in consumers, but then those brands aren't necessarily the sort of thing that we would stock as an independent. You know, we're not going to have something like Yellowtail or whatever on our list. And I do think there's a certain tendency amongst our staff, not customers, but staff, not to want to recommend these kind of wines that they might
have to get them on another wine flight, Oz, don't you think? We have to get the staff on a wine flight.
This is exactly the right thing, I think, because she's actually saying that there's a lack of those ambassadors in the independent trade at the moment, which was that generation which went on the wine flights isn't there anymore.
Absolutely. And I put a couple of questions out on Twitter yesterday, just before this, to some other independents, just to see, you know, how they were finding Australian wine sales. And several people mentioned trips that they'd been on. I do think that those trips might have been a few years ago. So, but it's really about infusing the staff, I think, because people come into our shops, they don't know what they want to buy. They're coming because they want to discover something new. So it's really about infusing the staff and getting them to understand that Australia isn't just this kind of wine that their parents used to drink and, you know, buy for £4. And there's a lot of exciting, interesting things happening.
I think going back to the wine tourism thing, and you said that South Africa is a bigger selection in your, and that rings true, is South Africa has done a fantastic job in bringing winemakers to the shops and making that personality engaging with wine drinkers and increasing the number of advocates they have for South African wine. And Mike mentioned is the difference between when Australia first started. Hazel brought the winemakers over, their baggy jeans, their no tie, their scruffy lumberjack shirts, and made them pour wine into people's glasses, which perhaps the old world wouldn't have done that. You wouldn't necessarily see Paul Pontellier pouring Chateau Margaux on in a hall in London. Do we think that the winemaker and bringing winemakers, even from the bigger companies, was a reason for this success, and it's building those advocacies?
I'm sure it's one of the reasons in the 80s and 90s, and they spoke English. And in the 80s and 90s, an Italian winemaker would hardly ever speak English. A French one or a Spanish one probably wouldn't. Now they mostly do. but in the 80s and 90s they didn't, and the Australians spoke a version of English that most of us could understand to a reasonable extent. But in the noughties, I think that Australia went wrong because it went down a completely understandable corporate route. You saw less and less of winemakers, and the winemakers you did see were the ones who the corporations thought were safe enough to let out in public. People started wearing suits, people started using marketing speak, and the wines all became blander and duller. And that's one of the great things for the rest of the New World, that Australia opened this massive door, which California could have opened. California had the chance, but the dollar got very strong, and they upped their prices very quickly in the 80s. And they went, people like Gallo to start with, and then people like Blossom Hill later on. They never seemed to actually talk about the real wine quality. If you were in Penfolds or Lindemans or Hardy's or Rosemount, they were talking about wine quality all the time. They lost that in the noughties, I think. But I think that what had been created by Australia made it much easier for Chile, much easier for South Africa, much easier for Argentina. But in a way, and I know that at ABS, you've got some extremely good, bearded, strange, offbeat winemakers. And there's a whole new breed in Australia of which we see a bit. But we see quite a lot of that breed now from not only Argentina and Chile and definitely South Africa, but also from parts of France and parts of Italy and parts of Spain. I think that Australia woke up the whole world of wine for us. And now, as in Emily's situation, Australia did a fantastically good job of making it more possible for Emily and her colleagues to sell them wines from other countries.
So we've sort of gone through this swing from lots of winemakers being bought over by Hazel, a bit of a lull in terms of the corporations spotting the potential and therefore throwing the suits at it. And then we have this advent again over the last few years. And I always like the Australia Day tasting always kicks off the year for us, especially. And it's always one of the best attended generic tastings in the calendar, and lots of winemakers are over, but I wonder what Australia can do to continue to build on the winemaker reputation building enthusiasts to continue what they started, say, 30 years ago. Emily, do you like having winemakers in store, or how do we transport consumers back to Australia, or find them their new best mate that's the winemaker in Geelong or where it might be?
We love having winemakers in store, and actually we had a tasting with an Australian winemaker a few years ago now, and he actually took half the attendees out to the pub with him.
That sounds very
tasting, and that created some. Yeah, we love having winemakers to visit, and I know it's difficult at the moment, and but Zoom tastings, at least with the staff who can then transport that enthusiasm to the customers. But yeah, totally, visits from winemakers are the best way.
And Ali, with you saying how many GIs you've got represented, I'm sorry, I forgot the exact number, but originally when Australia launched into the supermarkets, its popularity was its simplicity. It was, this is Shiraz, this is Chardonnay, sunshine in a bottle. It's juicy, it's easy to understand. Non-wine drinkers can understand it. And now there is, of course, a raft of diversity in Australia, which perhaps those who were brought up on Australian wine might not be aware of. Is how do we play to these strengths of these GIs and celebrate the diversity of Australia?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And if anyone knows the answer to that, can you just send me a note? It's hard, isn't it? Because the more complex a message gets, the more difficult it is to translate. I'm sure that the Kiwis and the Argentinians are equally as delighted and frustrated that they've got one main message coming out of their country. New Zealand Sauvignon and Argentinian Malbec is just, it's so simple. Customers just know, right, I'm just going to go and buy that, and I'm going to go and buy that. And now we're trying to tell them, oh wow, like actually, like forget what you knew about Australia, because it's so much more, and it's this and it's that and it's the other. And that's brilliant, and it's all very true, but that's very difficult for customers when it's such a crowded market. It's very daunting, often completely unfathomable to most people. To try and tell them that it's about everything is just a bit overwhelming. I mean, almost, if you want to sort of talk about Australia as we would all like to, then the new marketing spiel needs to be something more along the lines of "Go nowhere else. Australia has it all." You know, maybe that's it.
Heard
in
it
a
here
nutshell.
first.
Yes.
Yeah, we were here first. Go away. But you know, it's difficult. It's easier, I think, for customers. It's easier for marketing. It's easier for the industry in a way to get behind a single message than endless messages. So it's hard. It's hard.
But do you find people no longer come in and say, I want an Aussie Chardonnay or an Aussie Shiraz in the same way as they did 10 years ago?
Sorry, you're asking me that, Oz?
Yeah.
Both, I guess both of you.
I just wonder whether you found that Australia had actually spent so much time trying to diversify its image, it's actually weakened its effect in good operations like yours and Emily's.
For Waitrose, sort of 2/3 of what we sell from Australia is red, and largely it's Shiraz, and for whites it would be Chardonnay. So I think customers still are looking for what they know and what reassures them, and it's trying to pepper, I suppose, the diversity. It's trying to get that balance, isn't it? And between putting something more esoteric next to something that we know they're going to grab every day, in the hope that they might sort of look along the shelf and get that one next time. And you know, we are a bit luckier at Waitrose because we have a lot of loyalty behind the brand. So customers trust in us a little bit that if they bought that one and loved it, then they might try that one. But it's still hard. It's still not easy. I think customers gravitate to what they know.
Emily, do you find the same?
So I was just sort of thinking, and I was trying to remember the last time someone came to the shop and said to me, I would like an Australian wine, in the same way that they would say, I'd like something Italian, I want something Spanish, I'd like something from France. And I think maybe that's echoed in the diversity that we've got now coming out of Australia. I don't get a lot of requests for Australian Shiraz, despite the fact that we do still sell quite a lot of it. And actually,
I guess it's an easy sell. They don't need to request it if they know that you know it's there. Yeah.
That's the thing, exactly. And I think, as with Ali, most of our Australian wine sales are red as well. Shiraz makes up a lot of it, but actually premium Pinot is becoming really important for us as well. And I'm not sure whether that's a reflection of specifically Australia, or whether that's a demand for premium Pinot Noir that's more affordable than Burgundy and actually more approachable as well in many cases. So that would be kind of interesting to sort of monitor, I think.
I certainly think there's a tend towards some lighter styles of reds in consumers. A lot of virtual tastings I've been doing this year, a lot of people have said, oh, I love the Gamay the most, or the Pinot Noir the most, and actually the diversity of Australia does allow for these wines as well. It's obviously, it's not the go-to. So if you're looking to range your shelf as a new independent, and what box does Australia tick? It's very easy to fall into the Shiraz and Chardonnay box, less easy to fall into the, the only Gruner Veltliner I'm going to stock is going to be from the Adelaide Hills, or the only New World Pinot I'm going to stock is from Tasmania. And actually a light Chablis style Chardonnay, I'm going to try that from the Adelaide Hills as well. It's not an obvious ranging proposition, but I think, I'm really sort of, that's in go nowhere else for Australia. It's brilliant. I'm just thinking of our Nebbiolo, our Gruner Veltliner, and why go to Austria and Piedmont if we can stay in Australia? Oz, what do you think? I think this is Ali's onto something here.
The new generation in Australia, and I would led actually by wonderful old grumps like people like Steve Pannell. Who one thinks, he's been around for donkey's years, but he's absolutely new wave in the way he looks, and the way that the frankly fascinating flirtations, which have now become full relationships between the new generation of Aussies and biodynamism, organics, these kind of things that should be pretty easy on the whole in Australia. Sustainability in Australia, most of Australia should be pretty easy to do. The problem in Australia, of course, is where you get water and how you control heat. But actually the health, the disease side of things shouldn't be difficult to do. But also Australia basically led the way in the creation and utilization of good yeast technology, all kinds of winery technologies, which at this moment are slightly out of fashion. I'm sure they'll come back into fashion because there's just been too much good work being done on things like yeasts in the last 30 or 40 years to allow them all to be thrown out the window just to say, well, let's see what yeast our vineyard comes up with. But there is a new generation which is trying to tell that story. I suspect that they find it easier to sell wine in Australia. And so why should they come to England? And from what Ali and Emily are both saying, given that Australia is our largest import of wine, and two of the top quality level companies, the Oxford Wine Company and Waitrose, they both undertrade on Australia. So who's selling all this Australian wine, and what is it? I'm sure as hell, even if it's got a smart label, it won't be as good as this one was. And unfortunately, I suspect that the buyers who are bringing it in are pushing down on price as hard as they can, which means if you're making a big effort in Margaret River, or a big effort in the Adelaide Hills, or a big effort in Mornington Peninsula or something, why would you sell it to someone in Britain? And Elliot, you must find this at ABS. I'd love to sit in on one or two of the conversations you and Mike have with your suppliers, saying, please, we do desperately make the best of your wines. We love your wines. We want to persuade Britain to drink your wines, but we can't pay the extra $50 a case.
It's the classic when you're speaking to someone who's been to Australia, we don't see the best stuff in the UK. And you just think, you despair because we don't see the best stuff because no one's willing to pay for it. And therefore it does make it very difficult.
We see some of the best stuff.
It's the anecdotal
stuff. It's a bit, we don't see the best stuff from Piedmont. We don't see the best stuff from Brunello. We don't see the best stuff from Rioja.
It's the anecdotal consumer that has been there and likes to think that they've seen the best stuff and that we don't see it in the UK. But that happens from all, as you're right, as you say, happens from all places.
And Elliot, what is the best stuff? Of course. Stuff. Yeah. A couple of hundred cases that they charge you for, and no one can get unless they go on bended knee with a bunch of roses in their hand and say, please let me have a bottle. Is that actually the best stuff, or is that just the stuff that someone thinks makes them look better in their wine drinking world? Lots of the best stuff is made is made in much bigger quantities than some of the wine geeks pretend.
Ali, you must get requests from consumers all the time to say, why don't you list this? Why don't you list that? From consumers, of course, not from suppliers.
I think we need to remember, though, don't we, that in the market, the average retail price of a bottle of Australian wine is still less than £6. Because we're in the trade and because we're passionate about it and we know something about it, we tend to start talking about these exciting regions and small parcels of this and exciting winemaker that, and that's all brilliant and it's great chat, but does that filter down to the customer? Well, we're all trying to, but if a customer's spending less than, not at Waitrose actually, but in the market they're spending less than £6 a bottle, then there's a lot of work to be done, isn't there, to try and up that spend, because a customer won't be able to buy the best representation of what Australia can provide at that price, and it's a challenge. It's really hard.
I do want Mike's just mentioned, what do we reckon the percentage of wine sold in the Australian wine sold in the UK is bottled in market? And I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater to say that in-market bottled wine is inferior. I don't think that's the case at all. But what does often happen is wine is bought on the spot market as distressed bulk that is then bottled, and therefore is slightly inferior quality. And perhaps I wonder if that spot market distressed stock has anything to do with degrading the image of Australia.
Well, I would have thought it had to. I agree with you, absolutely, Elliot, that there's some very high quality bottling facilities in this country now. And when you actually see the quality, well, Ali, one of your two basic New Zealand Sauvignons, I think, are both bottled in this country, and they're as good as anything at £5 a bottle more from one of the bigger brands. That's simply because they've been made well, they've been chosen well, they've been transported well, yeah, and they've been bottled well at this country. And so I'm absolutely sure that it's possible to do really good bottling here. But the distressed stock is a factor, and it's going to be much more of a factor in the next 12 months because of the Chinese situation.
Well, yes, but let's finish on a positive note and say and really laud the diversity of Australia. So when I went to Tasmania in 2011 to do vintage at Tamar Ridge, and on my way down there and through South Australia, the old stalwarts of the industry said, "What on earth are you doing going down to Tasmania? It's the back end of nowhere. It's very boring." And then 4 years later, I went back with Hazel Murphy. And as I went back through South Australia, everyone said, "Oh, I'm very jealous you're going to Tasmania." The same people, very jealous you're going back to Tasmania. And I think even within Australia, the diversity is increasing, and places like the Adelaide Hills planting new grape varieties that are better suited to their climate than the commercial Pinot Grigio or Sauvignon Blanc that were perhaps previously planted in abundance. I think going back to Ali's point again is, why go anywhere else? Let's put this, you can fit the whole of Europe geographically into Australia, and let's celebrate the diversity of Australia and tell people no need to go anywhere else. Emily, you on board?
Sorry, no, I'm agreeing with you. I'm nodding in agreement completely.
Very good. No, I'm just coming round the circle just to close things off and say it's, again, thank you so much for joining, everyone. Anything last to add, Oz?
Well, it can do it all. You're absolutely right. Climate change is going to make it more and more of a challenge for them. But I mean, if you wanted someone to say to pick up a challenge, you'd go and find an Aussie.
Yeah. Ali, anything closing comments from you?
I think we just need to keep realistic about where the market's at and where we want it to be, and to just try and help the everyday customer on their journey of trying to learn a little bit more, and that it's going to take time. But you know, your story just then about Tasmania, it takes time, but we will get there if we're all passionate and we're all pushing in the same direction. And you know, I'm sure that we all prop up the industry by drinking Australian all the time, as well we should. It's just the most fantastic place, isn't it? We all know that. And so no, thank you for having me and letting me share my thoughts today.
Thank you so much. Very good, Emily. Any last comments? Or I'm excited now to sell more Australian wine.
So I just thought I wanted to mention that last year, the best tasting that we did of the year was, well, almost the only actually, was of Australian wine. And it was the most attended tasting that we've done. So customers are interested and they like it. So I hope we can kind of harness that and make the most of it going forward.
Fantastic. Well, everyone, thank you so much for watching. And Emily, Ali, Oz, thank you so much for joining and sharing your thoughts. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Elliot.